tonight, we've been dealing with all these different hope, identity. And do you remember when we were addressing the first part of our series, when we were addressing the allegations or the things why people reject Christianity? One of them was, well, religion has been such a tool for injustice in the world. And we kind of addressed that. But what I wanted to do tonight is I want us to dig deeper into this idea of justice. And I want us to see that Christianity offers a worldview of justice that no other worldview can touch. And as we walk through tonight, I think you'll see why this is true. There are people in our world, so secularists have a very tough time grabbing a hold of moral absolutes. We've addressed that in here in this series. Why it's difficult for them to believe in moral absolutes, because they have nothing to appeal to. They can't say we got these moral absolutes from God. We can't say that we got these moral absolutes from any transcendent thing whatsoever, because secularists or naturalists, they have a tough time grabbing a hold of moral absolutes and explaining where they came from and why they should be believed. At the same time, religious people don't have that problem. So religious people don't have a problem of where we got moral absolutes. What religious people tend to have a tough time of grabbing a hold of is, what they tend to be is they can become moralist. So it's very easy for religious people to take this idea of absolute truth and morality and then use that to intimidate and control other people with it. So you have relativists on one side that struggle with the morality issue. Then you have those who struggle with using morality to intimidate and control and oppress people. So you have those on either spectrum. Here's the question I'd like to ask first tonight as a way of introduction. Is religion a force for justice and good in the world, or is religion a force for injustice? You could build a case that it is both. You could build a very easy case that religion has been used for good and justice in the world, and religion has been used to intimidate and oppress and bring injustice in the world. Let me give you an example. The African slave trade was primarily brought to an end by Christian abolitionists. Okay? So if you want to point and say, why did the slave trade, the African slave trade in the United States end? You can point to Christian abolitionists who stood up and said, this is not right, we're made in God's image, and men are to be made free, and this goes against justice. At the same exact time, the creators and defenders of the slave trade were professing Christians as well, and even used the Bible to justify the African slave trade. So in that one issue, you see that religion is being used for good and justice, and it's being used for oppression at the very same time. So here's what we can't do. We can't deal with this issue of justice simply by adding up religious abuses on one side and adding up religious goods on the other. That's not how you can address it. You can't say, okay, is religion good for justice and human rights? You can't answer that question by saying, okay, here's all the evidence of what people have done that's abuse. Here's all the evidence of how religion's been used for good, and that's how we'll judge. And whatever the scale leans, that'll be how we get our answer. You can't do that because there's so much information on both sides. What would be better, and what we're going to do tonight, is look on the other grounds on which we're going to explore the relationship between religious faith and justice. There are other things that we can take into consideration that will help us make the decision on whether or not religion, and specifically Christianity, is a force for justice. So that's what we're going to do. First, I want to talk about justice and human rights. We could begin by asking, whether religion or secularism is better in support of human rights. Is naturalism or secularism better in addressing human rights, or is religion better at addressing human rights? Now let's deal with what are human rights. Okay, what is a human right? When we say there are human right violations, you've heard that, right, used in the media, I'm sure. Human right violations in other countries and stuff. You have to ask the question, what is a human right? Let me just give you an easy, simple way of thinking about it. It is whatever a human being has an obligation to or a claim to simply because they're a human being. So when somebody is in your presence, you have an obligation to treat them a certain way, and they have a claim over you to be treated a certain way. Okay, that is a human right. So when a person enters into your presence, human rights is an obligation or a claim on how that person should be treated. They have the right not to be killed by you. They have the right not to be tortured by you, defrauded by you, abducted by you. You get the point, right? They have a right, they have certain things that they have a right to because they are human beings in relationship to you. Now, these rights have nothing to do with their race or their gender. That has nothing to do with them being of certain moral character. So you don't get to say, well, this person is a horrible person, so they don't have the same human rights as somebody who is morally good. False. Human rights at their basic level have nothing to do with their morality. Has nothing to do with their race. It has nothing to do with their gender. They have these rights simply because they are human beings. Now, the question is, why do people have these rights? If we're going to say people have human rights to be treated a certain way, it's a good question to ask, where did those rights come from? How do we account for believing in human rights? It is not sufficient to say that they simply exist and we don't know why. That's not a good enough answer. Why do we believe in human rights? Well, we just do. We don't know why we do, we just do. Humans have rights, and that's our answer. And if human rights exist because we say so, so if I just say human rights exist because we all just say they exist, then what's the only way to get me to go along with your view of human rights? Well, you have to coerce me. You're going to have to make me. All right? If I can't agree with you that human rights exist, then the only way for you to get me to abide by human rights is to coerce me to do it. It's to make me to do it. Okay? Some might call that imperialism. We have this view, and so because we have this view, we're going to make you follow it. In order for other cultures to adopt Western cultures, right? If we determine in the West, we believe in human rights, but some other nation doesn't, and we have no real reason why they should, then the only thing we can think of to get them to do it is either money or military, sanctions. There's only political power to be used. That's the way that we're going to force people to do it. Now, many people see a problem with this. Many people argue that it is not good enough just to say we have human rights because we say so. Many people go, well, there's got to be a reason why. Why do we have human rights? And so some people say this, okay? We agree there's got to be a reason. So here's our reason. Human capacity. When a person has the capacity for rational choice, when a person has some other characteristic or aptitude, when those things are present, then that person has certain human rights. Now you see the problem in this already, don't you? What about unborn children? What about unborn children? They don't have the capacity for moral choice, right? They're not rational enough to make moral choice. And not even unborn children, what about infants? I mean, what about babies that have just been born? They don't have the cognitive or the rational thought processes to make, moral decisions. What about someone that's in a coma? Right? Now they're in a coma. They can't make. I mean, they're alive. They're breathing. Their body is functioning, but they're unconscious and they're not waking up. Do we then say, well, because they don't have certain capacities and they don't have certain aptitudes, we can just no longer apply human rights to them? Right? What about people that are very, very elderly? You see the problem with that being the reason why there are human rights. I was watching Ben Shapiro. He is an Orthodox Jew who is a conservative internet talk show host, and he goes around and he's in debates and stuff. And I saw this clip where this guy stands up after his lecture that he takes questions. And so people are lined up in the aisles with microphones, and this young man asked the question. He said, he's talking about abortion. He said, how can you say that abortion is wrong? And he said, well, first of all, we got to come to a standard for which we all agree on how we're going to treat human beings. And so he starts asking some questions about the young man. And the young man said, well, anyway, it got to Ben Shapiro bringing up a person in a coma. And he said, what about the person in a coma? Should we be able to kill the person in a coma because they're not capable at the time of making moral choices? And he said, well, they have the potentiality of waking up out of that. All right, they might be viable again. And Ben Shapiro said, you know what else is viable? A fetus. And of course the entire crowd just was in shock, because that's the argument they try to make. Well, we're not for killing people in comas. Okay, well then to be consistent, you can't be pro-choice either then. So the problem is that when secularists or naturalists try to answer this question about human rights, they have nothing to turn to on why people should be treated a certain way. Other than, well, that's just the way we think it should be. So if we don't base human rights on capacities, and we're not going to base it on, well, we just all think this is the way it should be, what do we base them on? There's a philosopher, I had never heard of him, but I looked him up after reading about him in one of Tim Keller's books. His name is Nicholas Waltersdorf. Here's what he contends. He contends that there is no plausible or better alternative for the grounding of human rights than the original religious basis. He says, if you evaluate all the reasons why people say that human beings should have certain rights, the only logical conclusion is a religious basis. All this means in the long run is that religious belief in God is a better support and grounding for human rights than any other worldview. That was his conclusion. As the Bible tells us, everyone is due human rights because they are made in the image of God, period. Why do we believe that people should be treated equally and fairly if we are a naturalist or a secularist? You cannot account for it. Christians, however, account for people being treated with justice and equality because we believe people are made in the image of God. Again, I've used this phrase before. If we are nothing more than cosmic stardust, if our brains are nothing more than chemical brain barf reactions, then who is going to hold me accountable for the way that I treat people? Christianity, however, offers an alternative. Now, this is right when the postmodern world starts doing the scale thing, right? They start doing the scale thing. And they start listing all the things over here. And then other people come over here and they list all the things over here. Again, not a good way to determine whether or not religion, and specifically Christianity, is a means for justice in the world. I'm going to use two terms, okay, real quick. And these are terms that I have heard philosophers use and theologians use. I'm going to use these two terms, and then I'll describe them, and we'll talk about it in a minute. The term is meta, M-E-T-A, narrative. Meta-narrative. The other term is micro-narrative. Okay? Meta means big, right? Something in total. Micro is small. All right? Now, I want us to be acquainted with those words, because what we're going to address here in a minute is very important. The postmodern world that we live in rejects meta-narratives. Okay? They reject any narrative that is totalitarian. So anything that says we have the answers to everything, that we absorb all events, we absorb all perspectives, all forms of knowledge are comprehensive in our view. Meta-narratives tend to be utopian. If we'll all just get on board with this, then everything will be great. Marxism, for instance, that is a meta-narrative. Marxism says, Marxism is this all-encompassing worldview that grabs everything and says, if you'll just do what we tell you to do inside this Marxist worldview, then we will have a utopian society. Okay? The people that reject meta-narratives would reject Marxism. But guess what they also reject? Capitalism. They reject capitalism too, because they think capitalism is a meta-narrative. All right? Now, when I first started thinking about this, I thought, well, Christianity is a meta-narrative. And then as I started thinking more about it, I thought, no, it actually isn't a meta-narrative, and I'll tell you why it's not in a minute. So they reject all that. Do you know what they instead replace it with? Micro-narratives. Let me see if you've ever heard this. Tell your truth. You ever heard somebody say that? You just tell your truth, right? Or you just stick to your truth. Here's what they mean by that. You have a micro-narrative in your life. What is true for you is true for you. It doesn't need to be true for everybody else. It doesn't have to be true for everybody else. Your truth is your truth, and you stick to your truth, and you live your truth. And while you're living your truth, I'm going to live my truth. You live your truth, I live my truth, and this person over here, they get to live their truth. And so what happens is everyone is living out their own micro-narrative. So instead of there being one meta-narrative that's all-encompassing of everybody, everybody has their own little small micro-narrative that they're living out. Now, they would say, if you believe in a meta-narrative, then you're using truth as power. You would say, this is true, and then it's a power play. Then you're going to try to get everybody else to follow in line with your truth. Micro-narratives don't do that. Micro-narratives don't say, this is true for me, and it also has to be true for you. Micro-narratives just say, this is my truth, and I'm going to tell my truth. And whatever your truth is, that's fine too. And this is where it all falls apart. Those that believe in micro-narratives, right, which is the majority of people in our society are moving more and more to that, they tell you that you should not believe in meta-narratives. That it's wrong for you to believe in a meta-narrative. It's wrong for you to believe in an all-encompassing truth that pulls everything in. Everybody's got to have their own truth. Then the question is, do I have to believe in a micro-narrative? Do I have to believe that everybody has the same truth? And they would say, well, yes, well, wait a minute. You know what they just did? Did you catch it? They created a meta-narrative to make everybody have a micro-narrative. You see what they did? They said no one can believe in a meta-narrative. That's like saying listen, absolute truths do not exist. Wait, yeah, are you sure about that? Didn't you just make an absolute claim that absolute truths don't exist? And when you say that there doesn't need to be any meta-narratives, but everyone needs to have a micro-narrative, what you've just done is create a meta-narrative that everyone has to have a micro-narrative. You've just done the very thing you're telling everybody not to do. You've created a rule, a truth that should be applied to everybody. Everyone has to have their micro-narrative. That statement, though, is a meta-narrative. You see what they've done? But it's like when a relativist, someone that just believes what's right for you is right for you, what's right for me is right for me, and you have to believe that. Wait a minute. I thought you said what's right for me is right for me. What if what's right for me is to think you're wrong? Am I still right? But you see the problem, right? It all begins falling apart because you have nothing outside of yourself you're looking to. This is why you either have the God of Christianity or you have unreasonable, illogical nonsense. That's why this series is called The Reason for God. Because if these are the things that happen if you do not have a transcendent being outside of ourselves that has revealed truth to us, then we're just making it up as we go along. And we contradict ourselves and we get ourselves stuck in a cycle all the time. For instance, if you ask a secularist or a narrativist, they'll give me the reason that you do not believe in God without using your reason. It's impossible, isn't it? You ever heard somebody say this? You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. You heard somebody say that before, right? You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. Why not? Well, it's a vicious cycle, they say. Well, you're saying this from the Bible, but how do I even know that's true? Let's turn that around. Give me a reason for your reason without using your reason. You see what they do? They're using their Bible. They're using their reason to prove their reason. Then they turn around and say, but you can't use your Bible to prove the Bible. Every time you use your reason to prove your reason, you're opening up your Bible. Their reason is their Bible. Now, the difference between Christianity and all this other stuff is that, because it's a cycle, right? We use the Bible to prove the Bible, and then the Bible proves the Bible, then the Bible proves the Bible, and we're just in a circle. Right? They're using their reason to prove their reason, and then, well, give me a reason for that. Well, they go back to their reason, and then they go back to their reason. So, you see the loop that everybody's in? It's called circular, right? It's just circular thinking. Here's the difference. We believe in a God that is outside of our circular reasoning, that has revealed truth to us. Naturalism or secularism doesn't have that. So they can't get out of their loop. They stay in their loop constantly. They say, well, why do you believe the Bible's true? Because we believe in a God who has revealed truth to us. So we eventually get out of our circular reasoning by appealing to a transcendent God that gave us truth. They can't get out of their circular reasoning because it's just constantly, well, I use my reason to prove my reason. I use my reason to prove my reason. So there's no substance they can stand on. It works the same thing with, well, what's true for you is true for me. Well, then what if my truth says your truth is a lie? Is my truth still truth? See the circular reasoning again that they can't get out of. All right? Meta-narratives are bad. They're bad. Everyone needs to have their own micro-narrative. And if you tell anybody what to do, it's wrong. You're telling me what to do right now. You see what happens? And we laugh about it because we come to this place where we realize the absurdity of it all. But the secular world is trapped in it. And then they're trying to convince us that they have the right answers to justice and human rights. They don't. They don't. There's a book written by Simon Critchley called The Faith of the Faithless. He is not a believer. Okay? He is not a Christian. In it, he asked the question about justice. How does it come about? How can we do it? And he basically says this: is it possible to practice politics properly without appealing to God? And an answer by an unbeliever is, no, it's not possible. It is not possible for a nation or a culture to practice proper moral politics without appealing to a transcendent God. You see, we can sit inside of our college classrooms all day long and talk philosophy and ask the question, is God dead? And all these things that Kant brought up, and all these things that all these philosophers talk about. But when it's time to practice those things in reality, you can't do it. You can't do it. And that's why this man who is not a believer says, you actually have to have an appeal to a transcendent God for practicing any morality to make sense. He says this: he doubts that the sacrifices necessary to create a just society will be born unless many people believe in and feel the infinite demand of love. The sort of demand that Jesus Christ made when he says in the Sermon on the Mount to love your enemies. Bless those that curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Those who spitefully use you and persecute you. That's a non-religious man who just said that. He said the only way for a society to have justice is to have the majority of the people in that society believe in the ethic of Jesus Christ. Because unless you're willing to love your enemies, this is all going to fall apart. If it is conquer my enemy and overpower my enemy, then this is all going to fall apart. So even the non-religious recognize that there is a need for something outside of ourselves to give us human rights, because if not, we just spiral around in circles. Around and around and around we go. So, what does Christianity offer? What is Christianity? What is the way forward then? Well, what we need, these are big words, ready? Get ready. What we need is a non-totalitarian, right? Means I don't come and force you into it. Meta-narrative, okay? A big overarching narrative that is not totalitarian. And we need a non-oppressive absolute. We need something that is absolutely true, but that does not oppress people. We need something that is a meta-narrative, right, but is not totalitarian, forcing you to do it. We need absolute universal values, but we need something that undermines the natural, powerful human inclination to dominate people. So we need something that's universally true without making human beings into oppressors that will dominate you to follow those values. And of course, this is exactly what Christianity is. Let me demonstrate a few of them. First, meta-narratives try to explain all reality. You have these in your notes, they're not going to be on the screen though. Meta-narratives try to explain all reality. What this leads to is pride, where you see all your opponents as irrational, dangerous, and delusional. Let me give you an example of this. How many of you, not that you probably sit down and watch The View every week, but how many of you have ever heard of Joy Behar? Right? She's been on The View for a long time. She is super, super, super obnoxious. I mean, with all love, she is obnoxious. Mike Pence was accused of It was really taken out of context, but he was accused of hearing from Jesus. Okay? She comes along and says, I'm sorry, that's called mental illness. The Vice President of the United States is mentally ill. It's one thing to talk to God. It's another thing if you think God talks to you. Okay, Miss Prideful. Right? If you don't agree with me, you're delusional. If you don't agree with me, you are irrational or you are anti-rational. You got a mental illness. But that's what the meta-narrative of Joy Behar causes her to believe about the Vice President of the United States. All right? Now, the biblical story is radically different than that. The biblical story gives us fundamental insights about human nature and purpose, but it leaves things outside of our understanding. All right, Psalm 88, you can turn there. I just want to read the last few verses of Psalm 88. While we're flipping there, were you going to say something, Randy, or you had a...
I was just going to say that aren't they, on the view, aren't they supposed to be, what do you call that, where they believe everybody's okay, you're right.
Yeah, relativist, yeah.
Except Mike Pence.
Right, yeah. Except Mike Pence, because his thing's irrational. Look at just 13 through 18. Okay? This is a psalm. Remember, psalms are songs. Listen to this psalm. Here's the conclusion of the psalm. Tell me how well this would play on a Sunday morning if somebody put some music to this. But I, O Lord, cry to you in the morning. My prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death, from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am hopeless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me altogether. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. Amen. Glory. Hallelujah. That's the end of the psalm. Guess what this psalmist doesn't have? Answers. He doesn't know. Why are you doing this to me, God? Why are you putting me in this place? He doesn't have answers on why God is doing what God is doing. When we read the story of Job, right? We're never told why God did all that. Or Job, at least, is never told. I mean, we have an insight that Job didn't even have, right? Job, at the end of all this, had to be thinking, what was all this about? You know, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 12 says, we see in part, like through a glass dimly. Guess what Christianity doesn't? This is why it's ultimately not a meta-narrative. You know what Christianity doesn't say? Hey, I got all the answers. I got all the answers. Christianity says, listen, I'm not God. And there are things that God does that I cannot explain to you. I don't have the answers to all of reality and why everything happens. So it puts us in a place where we can be humble. Because we're not in the proud position of saying, and that's why it drives me crazy. Y'all remember right after 9/11? People immediately came out in the Christian world and said, this has happened because of this. I was screaming at my TV, shut up. You do not know why God did this. It is right to say that God was in charge of 9/11 and that ultimately it was His sovereign plan. You are not right to say why God did it. You do not know. Christianity is not a meta-narrative that says we know all the answers to these things. No, you don't. Then they got to come back and apologize after they make fools of themselves and say, well, the reason why Katrina happened is because, do you know all the sin in New Orleans? And then when it's pointed out to the man that said that Bourbon Street was not affected by a flood, how does that make any sense then? You would think if God's going to hit a street, it's going to be that one. But you see what happens? But Christianity if followed properly, puts us in a humble place where we say, man, I don't know. I don't know, and it breaks my heart that people are suffering. But I can't give you all the answers. Secondly, meta-narratives offer the prospect of solving all the world's problems. Again, Marxism. If you just do what we say, we're going to eventually be in a utopian society. Christianity doesn't teach this. Christianity doesn't believe that there is a redemption that human beings are going to bring about. That if we as human beings just do this, all the world's problems will be fixed. In Christianity, the future redemption that's going to take place is going to be done by God, not us. God's going to do this work. So we don't believe that Christians have the answers to all of the world's problems. As if you just put Christians in charge and all these problems are going to disappear. We know that's not true. We know that's not true. The biblical stories do not lead us to think this way. You look at all the biblical stories in the Old Testament. Characters face forces, both evil and good, that are beyond their control. They win through faith and trusting in supernatural grace. They do not bring about the victory themselves. For the Christian then, redemption cannot be a utopian hope in progress. Human ingenuity. But only in God and in God's time. Third, meta-narratives through their claims of truth can lead to domination. But the biblical plot line reveals a story where God repeatedly chooses those that were dominated, not those that dominate. He picks the wretched, the poor, the powerless, the marginalized. He picks those kinds of people to do great things with. He picks Abel, not Cain. He picked Isaac, not Ishmael. He picked Joseph, not Reuben. He picks Rachel, not Leah. He picks Jacob, not Esau. He picks Ruth. He picks David. And on we can go. Christianity is not about a force dominating. Where we go and we pick out the brightest and the best and the smartest because we're going to take over the world. It's not what Christianity does. And the reason why these stories are in the Bible is not simply because we like underdog stories. It is because it's the ultimate example of God working through human beings and ultimately the human being, Jesus. What do we talk about today? There was nothing about him. You wouldn't look at Jesus and think, that's the Savior of the world. Look at that guy. No. All those underdog stories in the Old Testament are simply shadows pointing to how God was going to use Jesus Christ to save the world. Most meta-narratives say, here's how we're going to win. Pull yourself together, master yourself, master the situation, be strong, you can do it. Jesus says, you can't do it. You have to rely on me. And unless you become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. We do not get heroes of the faith, but people that the world would not have picked to be leaders. The Bible is not primarily a series of stories with a moral application to them. Rather, it is a record of God intervening by grace in the lives of people who do not seek it, do not deserve it, and people who resist it. So Christianity is a story that breaks the cycle. It's a story that breaks the cycle of injustice. The cross is the event in human history that sets people free and does not make those free people become oppressors themselves. Jesus saved us by becoming the oppressed for us, as Brother James talked about this morning. When we distort the biblical story, then Christianity can be used to oppress people. But if you stick to the biblical story, Christianity cannot be used to oppress people. It cannot be used to oppress people when you actually use the gospel story. The story of the cross is believers of Christ being taught to confess that we know we are the wrongdoers who have oppressed people. I have not loved my neighbor as myself, and I have sinned against God by doing it. I am an oppressor that needs to be forgiven. In other words, every Christian knows that they need to oppose the oppressor. Right? We got to stand for justice and oppose the oppressor. But we do it in such a way, realizing that if not for the grace of God, that would be me. So I deal with them in a way of love and humility when I oppose the oppressor. Because if not for the grace of God, I'd be the exact same way. And we continue to be the oppressor. So here's what we have in Christianity. We have this story where instead of dominating over people, Jesus comes, born of a virgin in a lowly manger, and saves the world through being oppressed and suffered. By His stripes we are healed, everything that we heard this morning. Then we are brought into the story because God humbles us and reveals to us that we can't do it, reveals to us that we, in our sin, have been oppressors, and we need to be freed from not loving our neighbor as ourselves. And so now we step into the story with desiring for justice to be done, but realizing it's not in our own power. It's not in our own power. I don't take this upon myself. God's going to do this. My job is to speak the truth in love, to be humble, but to speak the truth in love, and not become an oppressor myself. People are not going to be won over because I lord over them and dominate them. You're going to be won over by the grace of God. And that is a radically different worldview when it comes to human rights and justice than any other worldview on the planet. No other worldview comes close to dealing with justice the way that Christianity does. Because we see the oppressed and we say, that's wrong. And then we step in and we say, we're going to be a part of the answer. And we're going to call out the oppressors. But we're going to call out the oppressors in such a way, realizing that if it was not for the grace of God, I too would be that oppressor. So I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it differently. The gospel of Jesus Christ provides a non-oppressive absolute truth. It's one that is not relative, is one that is not purely selfish and individualistic. It is one that will not oppress others. And again, this kind of worldview is only found in Christianity. There is no other worldview, because no other worldview has a suffering servant Messiah. No other worldview has that. Only Christianity has a suffering servant